We're in the home stretch of the election at the moment. Voting is underway, and indeed many Australians have already cast their ballots. However, it's still useful to try to make an informed vote. And in prior videos, I've discussed some of the policies of the major parties, being Labor, the Liberals, and the Greens. And I've also discussed how I intend to vote. However, now it's time to focus on the Teals. The Teals have been polarising. On the one hand, they seem to have a cult-like following amongst some of their supporters, people who seemingly just blindly follow the Teals as if they're the second coming. On the other hand, many other organisations are plastering signs around their electorates, warning us not to be tricked by the Teals, and suggesting that the Teals might just be Greens aligned, and might in fact be Greens in disguise. So let's have a look into this and see what we can discern about the Teals' policies. And it might come as no surprise to viewers of this channel that I don't particularly support the Teals, and I think they're being disingenuous about what their policies actually are, and they're significantly more left-wing than they paint themselves out to be, especially on fiscal matters. However, I should of course note that the Teals are notionally independent. They do run as independents, and they aren't per se part of a party, as much as they appear to act as one. Allegra Spender, Monique Ryan, Zoe Daniels, Zali Steggall, Nicolette Bowl, Sophie Scamps and Kate Cheney, amongst all of the other Teals, do offer marginally different policy platforms. However, there are significant common threads that tie them all together, and all but Zali Steggall feature prominently on the Climate 200 website, suggesting a significant common theme. Nevertheless, let's analyse them in detail. And if you've got any thoughts about the Teals, well, let me know that in the comments below. Now, the first thing I want to start with is that Teals appear to be hypocritical in the extreme. All of the Teals talk about doing politics differently, but all too often they are just as bad as the major parties. And it's very easy to find examples of this. And I won't go through all of the examples, but I will pick a couple of choice ones. The Teals like to criticise the major parties for their transparency, or their lack thereof. Now, there are certainly valid criticisms associated with this. However, it is a little bit hypocritical if you yourself are lacking transparency and you're criticising the major parties. You need to make sure that you're actually walking the talk. And it appears that the Teals aren't really doing so very effectively. For example, it's emerged that Allegra Spender had engaged an agency who had paid influencers to really act on her behalf and to promote her. Now, this is reported by the ABC, so it's not as if this is just coming out of right-wing places. It's coming out of the ABC, which is very clearly Teal-friendly. Now, the influence disclosure was reportedly rather lackluster, perhaps only indicating that the posts were, quote, made in collaboration with Allegra Spender. Now, of course, I'm not alleging any necessary wrongdoing here. However, it certainly does look a little bit shonky. And it looks like there are payments for friendly influencer coverage. That's at least what I infer about the situation. But maybe you infer things differently. I do, however, see the situation as a little bit of a joke. Think of it this way. Suppose you were going to be influenced by a journalist, and prior to the journalist interviewing you, you are paying them either directly or into some other entity that's associated with them. How do you think that interview is going to go? I see it somewhat similarly with the influencers, although the influencers certainly are not held to the same degree of impartiality as journalists supposedly are. Nevertheless, that tells us that those influencers are hardly impartial, and I would think that at the very least there should be disclosure of that payment. After all, influencers are supposed to do so when they're paid to promote a product. You would think they should have to disclose when they're being paid to promote a particular candidate. The AEC seems to indicate that that disclosure is not necessary, but I would have thought, at the very least, it is ethical to make that disclosure, and if you're going to make transparency the bedrock of your platform, you should be transparent about who you are paying to promote you. Now, of course, Labor is just as bad. Labor brought influencers into the budget lockup and reportedly paid for their travel to the budget lockup. Now, clearly, therefore, they gave these influencers a scoop that no other influencer would have had, and that has clear monetary value. So Labor was obviously trying to curry favour with select influencers as well. Nevertheless, the Teals really can't talk about transparency. And they also don't like questions about this. Monique Ryan was unable to say whether she felt politicians should pay influencers. This was asked about on the ABC. Again, hardly a hostile environment for at Teal. Let's take a listen.
But should it be clear to voters, people who are looking at this content, that it's paid for by the politician?
Look, I don't really have an opinion on it.
Really?
I think, well...
You don't think voters deserve to know that if someone they're watching is saying great things about a politician, whether they're being paid by that politician?
Look, I'd have to give it some thought. It's not something I've given great thought to myself. Obviously, I haven't engaged in anything like that myself.
You'd have to give that some thought.
Well, I would think that it would be clear. I don't know. I think I'd have to give it some thought, David.
So you might be all right with politicians paying for content that voters have no idea money's changing hands.
Monique Ryan also dodged questions about this from Sky News journalists. Now, Sky, of course, is going to be less friendly than, say, the ABC, but the fact that she couldn't even answer any questions about this is rather telling. She just told the journalists to go away and that she didn't want to do an interview.
Just want to know how your campaign's going this morning.
It's going well, thanks, Laura.
Yep.
But I am here to engage with voters. We're at pre-poll. It's the middle of the election campaign. So I'm not sure that it's really ideal for you to be interrupting the process.
Have you had any other thoughts about whether it's okay to pay influencers?
Thanks.
Sorry, Laura, she's already declined the interview.
Now, she was being asked these questions outside a polling booth in a public area. Politicians should expect to be stopped and asked questions when they are out in public, especially when they're at a political location. The fact that she was not willing to answer questions is telling. Now, Allegra Spender does appear to have a bit of a glass jaw as well. Allegra Spender has blocked my personal account on Twitter/X after I'd called her out for some of her policies, but she's also seemingly just trying to hide comments that are calling her out on other things. When I commented under this channel's account, she hid my comment. Now, my comment in particular was specifically in relation, or my reply was specifically in relation to a post she made about allegedly illegal pamphlets circulating in Wentworth. The main problem with these pamphlets was that they were improperly authorised, i.e. they stated they were, quote, authorised by the people of Wentworth for the people of Wentworth. However, that means they had an improper authorisation statement, rendering them illegal, to use Allegra Spender's words. Now, my reply to her post concerned the fact that the Teals had been alleged to have paid influencers to promote them, but those influencers did not appear to have appropriate authorization statements. She hid my reply. It appears she just doesn't want to really answer many questions about this. So much for transparency. And the foregoing, to my mind, is just a snippet of some of the issues. And let's not forget some of the other incidents, such as when Monique Ryan's husband allegedly improperly removed some campaign signs, or incidents where Allegra Spender's campaign team had put up corflutes so that as election signs on power polls, which is contrary to the regulations. Something that one might not necessarily notice given the sheer magnitude of all of these election signs. But if you're going to be running a campaign about transparency and doing things differently, well, you need to make sure you're complying with the election rules. And the whole situation just makes the Teals look really rather hypocritical. Now, that of course is one of the major bugbears with the Teals, but it is certainly not the only one I have. The next major issue I have with the Teals is their tax policy, and here I regard the Teals as disingenuous, potentially outright dishonest. And let me explain why. The closest information we've got about their tax policy comes from Allegra Spender's tax green paper, to use her words. The other Teals appear to have signed on supporting that tax green paper. Now, Allegra Spender likes to talk about trying to lower income taxes. However, she is seemingly, in my opinion, lying by omission because she's omitting all of the tax hikes. These other tax hikes include clear intentions to increase capital gains tax. Now, I want to be very clear here, that's absurd. Australia's capital gains tax is already one of the highest in the world. Think of it this way. The capital gains tax rate is your marginal tax rate in Australia. If you hold an asset for more than a year, you get a capital gains tax discount, taking the tax rate down to half your marginal tax rate, potentially over 22.5%. it is actually a rather large tax rate. Now, when it's a short-term tax, it's 47.5% potentially. Now, compare this to the United States. We can get it down far below that, including in the corporate tax rate of 21%. Dubai, 0%. Singapore, 0%. Hong Kong, significantly lower. In New Zealand, also 0%. Australia has significantly higher capital gains tax than every other country, and she wants to increase it. Let me use a rather telling example. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam, which is run by the Communist Party of Vietnam. Keep those in mind. Communist Party is running it. Their capital gains tax rate is 20%. The Communist Party has a lower capital gains tax rate than Allegra Spender wants. I think that says it all. It tells us that she's basically just pulling the wool over our eyes about what she intends to do with taxation. Increase CGT, increase taxes on superannuation, seemingly leaving the door open to inheritance tax because she wants everything on the table. Allegra Spender's tax reform, so to speak, is a recipe for a tax hike. I think her tax green paper and her rhetoric surrounding it is disingenuous and dishonest. And I think she really needs to level with people whenever she says she wants to decrease income taxes. She needs to tell people she's looking to increase taxes on everything else, including also GST. The other teals appear to have signed on to this, although of course they don't seem to have independent tax policies of their own. And Allegra Spender is the main problem there. She is exponentially worse than the Liberals, who I am not particularly a fan of at the moment. I find them very wishy-washy and flip-floppy, but at least the Liberals don't want to hike taxes in this manner. Like I've said before in prior videos, I am libertarian-leaning, so therefore I don't think the Liberals are doing a brilliant job either, but they are less bad than Allegra Spender. So when people are saying preference the majors last, well, that only works if the majors actually happen to be worse than some of these independents, and that isn't always the case. The next issue is free speech. The independents here, or the teals rather, have been rather lukewarm on free speech. Now, of course, they all have marginally different policies on this, so we can't lump them together perfectly, but there are some clear common themes. And the main one I want to focus on here is Zoe Daniel. Now, the teals generally supported regulations against so-called misinformation and disinformation, words that I regard as being weasel words that just represent anything that you happen to disagree with, particularly if you happen to be the government. I.e., Labour says everything is misinformation when it just happens to be criticising them. Nevertheless, the teals also appear to want regulations to stop so-called misinformation. Now, Labour's policy ultimately failed because it didn't get support in the Senate, and the piece of legislation just went by the wayside. However, Zoe Daniel put up a private member's bill that also went nowhere, which is rather unsurprising because such bills never go anywhere, but it gives us an idea about where their policy stances are, where they would want a duty imposed on social media companies in relation to misinformation and disinformation. Now, of course, like I said, that bill never went anywhere, it never had any chance, but it tells us what the teals want to do. They are hardly supporters of free speech. And therefore, if you are concerned about independence and liberty, the teals are also bad. So let's circle this back around. Often the teals are competing against the Liberals. The Liberals, again, I've found to be not brilliant on free speech. They admittedly were less bad than Labour because they ultimately did come around to resisting the misinformation and disinformation bill, but at least they resisted it in the end, whereas the teals just want to go down the same path. So the teals are more controlling, want higher taxes, and are generally just going to make our lives worse. They're effectively just control freaks. They want ever more government control, and if you criticize them, they'll cry foul and block you. They're classic cry bullies. Now, the next thing, of course, is energy policy. Now, this should come as no surprise. The teals basically just want renewables, no nuclear, phasing out fossil fuels. Effectively, they're very much like the Greens in this respect. Now, of course, I have no particular per se objection to renewables. However, there's a difference between being happy with renewables being part of the energy mix and thinking that they can magically be a solution to all of our energy needs tomorrow, which is clearly not going to be viable because renewables are going to get more and more expensive the more we need to build them out. Think of it this way. Some parts of geography are easy to build renewables on, some are really difficult, either because of the terrain, because of what's already there, or because they're just really distant from civilization and you need the infrastructure to get the electricity from the solar panels or whatever it is to where people live. That means that the more and more renewables you are building out, the more expensive each incremental renewable piece of energy you are building is going to be. So we can't just assume that renewables are going to be cheap forever. Furthermore, we can't just assume away the cost of replacement and the cost of damage and the like. Nevertheless, renewables could form a part of the energy mix, but it won't be all of our energy mix tomorrow, and things like LNG are going to remain important. And the Teals don't appear to really get this, wanting to resist any new fossil fuel projects, even though we do very much need energy, and if we make energy increasingly expensive, then in reality it will just slow economic growth and will slow our ability to raise more revenue to pay for the spending the Teals and Labour, and in reality also the Liberals, seemingly just want to add inexorably onto the budget. The Teals' energy policies do very much line up with those of the Greens. Then we've got the issue in relation to Indigenous policy. Indigenous policy is not really front and centre of the Teals' policy platform, but we did see that the Teals went all in behind the voice referendum, which gives us an idea of where they would sit if we were looking at Indigenous policy going forward. They clearly did support the voice. They would also seemingly support a treaty because that was the natural corollary of the voice coming into being. So it appeared that the Teals are also out of alignment with the majority of Australians. I will note, however, that many of the Teal electorates did vote in favour of the voice, although not by massive margins, and there are still a large number of people in those electorates that did not vote for the voice. Nevertheless, if the Teals are holding the balance of power with Labour, we can see Labour just forcing through more of these policies in the next parliament. So those are my thoughts about the Teals. I think they're hypocritical, I think they're disingenuous, I think they're pulling the wool over people's eyes about what their policies actually are, and therefore, I also think that the Teals' policy campaigns are inherently dishonest. Dishonest by omission. Dishonest by not telling us things. Dishonest when their billboards say they want to cut income taxes, but they don't tell us that they want to increase taxes in other ways. I think that is misleading voters. And I'm sure that the Teals would say, oh, we're not really being dishonest, people can check out our tax green paper. But in reality, who is going to their website other than, well, people who are really interested in it, or people who are really incensed by the Teals? I suspect that they realize that many people have busy lives and have better things to do with their lives than go on to their websites. So I think they are also being very disingenuous. And for these reasons, there's no way I would support the Teals. For these reasons, I am not voting in favour of my local Teal member, which is Allegra Spender, and I'm personally voting for Ro Knox, which is the Liberal candidate instead. I know, of course, that some of my viewers would be saying, well, I shouldn't really be voting for one of the major parties, I should vote for one of the minor ones. But in my electorate, the other candidates were basically Ro Knox, who is the Liberal, then we was the candidate from One Nation, but I really couldn't find much information about who he is as a person. There was no real information on One Nation's website, and I had huge difficulty even working out who I was voting for. There was a young fellow who was only 19 years old who also wanted to increase taxes, who I would obviously not put first either, and then there was Labour and Greens. Really, given the choices I had, it was obvious how I was going to vote. In the Senate, clearly I voted Libertarian first for these reasons. I very much hope that the Teals lose significant power in this upcoming election. However, I fear that they will retain their seats, unfortunately. But let me know your thoughts about the Teals in the comments below. Do you think the Teals are community representatives offering a principled alternative to the major parties, or do you think they're just disingenuous hypocrites? Let me know what you think.